What I want to talk about this morning is the logarithmic shadow. And the introduction to this is a friend of mine that I knew from the 90s who was a participant in an online forum called SCAA, of which I was a moderator and fact keeper. And that's Soap Culture African American. Posted something about MAGA hate in defense of DEI programs, generally speaking. And I think he's missing the point, but I understand where he's coming from. Because we were friends. We still are. And he's a very smart guy. And I think there are a lot of smart people who are being reactionary. And I need to explain something that's not easy to explain, but I think I can do it. So, I'm going to talk to you like you're my audience, and hopefully I can keep this pace good, but even though it's probably not good for video, it would be good for a presentation. So the story begins in the recent years, in our recent memory, about a character who became a very important symbol in America. His name is Michael Brown. And he came from a city that became a very important symbol in our society called Ferguson, Missouri. And what happened was that axiomatically, this city had a rotten government. And this government was so bad that its citizens burned it down. And America's focus, which is not scattershot, but also not consistent, rushed to look at Michael Brown and make them emblematic of America. And that has something to do with the way we think about ourselves and race. So, while Ferguson burned, it exemplified a few things that were very simple. There was a lack of trust between the citizens and their elected officials. And so America did turn its focus on Ferguson. And a lot of people, for good moral reasons, made moral judgments. But what didn't happen was people in Beverly Hills didn't pack up their bags and go back like a reverse Beverly Hillbillies. Pundits, experts, all had their opinions. But Alan Dershowitz, for example, a brilliant attorney, did not leave New York to run for mayor of Ferguson. A well-trusted police chief, say the chief of police of Dallas, didn't leave Dallas to go to Missouri and run for police chief. The best mayor in the country didn't leave their jurisdiction to go run Ferguson, even though it was obvious to everyone that Ferguson had failed the basic test. Can the citizens trust their government to protect them? We understand it didn't take long for us to recognize whether or not Ferguson was emblematic of something about race on the whole country. But the basic fact was they failed to provide for the common defense, secure the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their children. So, we the people, if I was in Ferguson, I would say we the people are not being served here. Something's going wrong here that is unconstitutional. And you should expect human beings to react the way they did. There's no law and order here. There is no fair government here. Something went very wrong. But Dershowitz didn't go. The police chiefs didn't go. All of our experts just looked at Ferguson and said, shame on you. Look at what you've done. But we didn't fix the problem. We knew that the same mayor, the same police chief, the same governor in that state retained their positions. And it meant they might do the same thing again. But they were bad. They were bad government. And we didn't fix it. So I've said 3 analogies about who didn't go to live with the problem and show them how it should be done. Instead, we wagged a finger. I don't think anybody wants to go and live in Ferguson, Missouri. If I was there, I would have found a way to get out. And by the way, which I only recently learned, Ferguson, Missouri is just down the block from East St. Louis, Missouri. And East St. Louis, Missouri and Ferguson, Missouri are not good places. Even though it is the headquarters for Emerson Electronics, which is a global firm and the biggest employer in the area. We'll come back to Ferguson and Emerson. The way that I thought about the logarithmic shadow is this. If you have a losing team, let's say a high school team, and your basketball record is 0-15, you're kind of like the government of Ferguson. And everybody will know. You're not doing well. You're doing it wrong. But Michael Jordan does not buy the team. Michael Jordan does not go to coach the team. Michael Jordan does not go to play for the team. Why is that? It has something to do with our sense of fairness. There's something that I call the logarithmic shadow, which means when you're an order of magnitude more powerful or more capable, then you want to compete against people that you can compete against. You don't bully. You don't pick on people who are weaker than you. So from that perspective, you could say, oh, it makes sense by this understanding of human behavior that we will just wag our fingers. We will just say, yeah, I would hate to live there, and I'm not going to go there and fix it, but it's obvious to me what should be fixed. If you got rid of these incompetent people, then the problem would be solved. So you have a tension between letting people be free to make mistakes, even if they end up being self-destructive, or forcing a solution, taking over. So what did Alan Dershowitz, and I'm not picking on him only because he's a fascinating name. And I'm not picking on Michael Jordan either. And I don't happen to know a brilliant police chief who everybody celebrates. We don't tend to do that. They will take some lesson and say, well, I hope we don't do that here. And even though they haven't done it there, even though they haven't shot a presumably innocent person and made everyone lose total faith in government and then demonstrate their corruption later, we say, well, let's keep that in mind. So here's the problem. Again, this tension on the logarithmic shadow is, do we leave people to their own fate, or do we go and take over? I think the logarithmic shadow is a good thing. And I think meritocracy is a good thing. But I also don't want to play basketball against Michael Jordan. All right? I don't want to face Alan Dershowitz as an opposing attorney. Okay? I don't want to go head to head against the best. And especially if they're an order of magnitude better than me. It's not fair. It's not fair. So we should, according to our understanding of fairness, be fair where we are. Obey the rules where we are. Let basketball be basketball, but then there's a high school league, there's a college league, there's a semi-pro league, there's a pro league, there's an Olympic league. There are leagues where we can be ranked by our skill, by those things that let us know how good our basketball game can be. We have objective measures of basketball to let us know if that's a good player or not. What is their shooting percentage from the free throw line? Can they dribble well and move fast, left-handed or right-handed? Do they do assists? So we adopt protocols and key performance indicators to say and generate a sense of the skill levels involved, and then we segregate people into leagues where they can compete fairly. And then sometimes we'll just have an open league. We'll have an open league where it says anybody can come and play, like the Masters golf tournament. And we say, get here, but if you don't make the cut, you'll be eliminated. And then the best of the best for that particular weekend will play, and they win the cup. And then they're invited again the next time, and we leave some open spaces. This is competition. And Americans have generally not broken the rules of good sportsmanship in their professional sports leagues. And these are leagues in which the rules everybody can understand. Everybody can participate. Everybody knows that the best two teams are going to the Super Bowl. But there's still a logarithmic shadow. We're not going to substitute in the poor kid from the poor high school, from the poor basketball team to get into the NBA Finals. We're not going to take a random kid off the street who has become a symbol of failure in their town and replace the quarterback to say, oh, I don't know. Let me not be snarky. That's the difference between equity and equality, as I see it. Equity means an equal investment in an outcome rather than an equal opportunity to compete on a fair playing field. So, whenever we think of analogies, when people are trying to convince us that the system is broken, rather than just Ferguson has a Ferguson problem, we're always told that some people have been hobbled in the race, that they're too short to see over the fence. And that's true. Human beings have varying levels of skills. But what's broken? Now, here's the weird thing. When you decide to make an open competition and you take someone from beneath your shadow, when you are an order of magnitude better, they will fail. Sometimes they'll surprise you. But the odds are, the statistics are going to say, if you can measure them fairly, that they're not going to survive well at a higher level of competition. Now, education is that thing where we inculcate stress to demonstrate human beings are anti-fragile. You exercise your muscles, break those muscles down and grow new muscles so you become yoked, buff, stronger. And that's how human beings are. We're resilient, but we're also anti-fragile. And we're anti-fragile in a lot of ways. And I won't go into anti-fragility, but I take that as a basic truth about human beings. Children cry less with the same injury. So in that way, Homer Simpson is right when he says, that's the worst thing you've encountered so far. And when you're an adult, you don't cry over spilled milk or a dropped ice cream cone. When you're a child, it destroys your world. So an adult who cries over spilled milk or a dropped ice cream cone, or who decides to change the rules above the logarithmic shadow in solidarity with victims at a lower level, that introduces another kind of corruption. My friend Dwayne, who works at JPL, is the person that I mentioned at the beginning of this. And Dwayne is obviously working at one of the top institutions in America for science. And I, being a data engineer and someone in STEM, before they even called it STEM, understand how engineers think. I am one. And I know the discipline. And I know our respect for methodologies. And when we adopt pro-social attitudes, we are thinking emotionally. And our thinking emotionally sometimes leads us in the right direction, and sometimes it causes us to break protocol. The very protocols that make what we do successful. And that is a problem because, of an ideological battle that's going on in America right now. And if you're watching football, you know that on the helmets of many teams is "Don't hate" or "Choose love." And success or failure in America is generally not because of a lack of love or the presence of hate. And to mischaracterize what we do with race as matters of love and hate misses the point. So now, give us a minute so that we can talk about what we need to be doing versus what we are doing about race. There's lots of ways to explain my own view of race, but the easiest thing to say is it's worthless. As a scientific thinker, I understand that once upon a time we believed in something called the ether. And the ether was this thing that surrounded the earth, and flows of energy somehow went through this ether. But since it's such a nonsensical idea that's been disproven hundreds of years ago, I don't even have an accurate understanding of what the ether was supposed to be, or phlogiston. More often I use the analogy of how many angels dance on the head of a pin. Because I went to Catholic school, and I know that that was a theological debate. And theology was our first educational system. We had churches before we had universities. And race is one of those superstitions that people use to explain things that they can't explain. Now, I understand that there has been a great deal of sociology done, and that people make a lot of things, studies, predictions based on race. But what we should know is that in our fairest institutions, our sports institutions, where everybody knows the rules, in our elementary schools, where everybody understands reading, writing, and arithmetic, Black Americans, African Americans have made remarkable progress. And while there was explicit racial discrimination in the South, it was not the same as it was in the North. So now I'm going to kind of go off script. And the question that resides in my mind right now is, what's the difference between East Berlin and West Berlin? Those of you who have lived through the Cold War knows that the Iron Curtain, the difference between the borders between communist countries and capitalist countries, split the city of Berlin in two, one controlled by the Soviets and one controlled by the traditional government of Germany. And checkpoints along that were heavily patrolled. There was a hard discrimination between citizens of East Berlin and West Berlin. And there was a protocol. You couldn't go. There was an apartheid. There was a Jim Crow. And when the wall finally came down, the people from East Berlin moved as fast as they could into West Berlin, but we do not think of Berlin today in terms of East and West. And I wonder, though I don't know, if people in East Berlin got reparations for what happened 50 years ago. If they grew up under the influence of the Soviets and couldn't get bread or coffee and stood in line for those things, once the wall was turned down, did they need an extra incentive? Did they need anything? So that's one aspect of this that I want to have you think about. What is our need for affirmative action today? How long does that affirmative action have to last? And is it the proper categorization? Now, the categorization is another rabbit hole that I'm interested in. As a data scientist, I know human beings have many, 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 many attributes. And the part of those attributes that we actually pay attention to depend on what our interests are in terms of a market value. For example, if you are a sociologist, everybody knows that in America, income inequality is one of the things that we like to talk about. And we always want to talk about income inequality by race. But the more you know about people of a race, the more you know that they differ one from the other. And there are orders of magnitude of difference. And there are basic things that people lack within that large 50 million population of 50 million people. And there are things that some of those 50 million have. You can't just impose race and say, this is what race dictates, or this is what race absolutely indicates. Because if Michael Jordan doesn't go to the 0-17 basketball team and play, it doesn't matter that they belong to the same race. It's a violation. It's not fair. It breaks the logarithmic shadow. It destroys the leagues. Now, we have AI, or something close to it, but we also have machine learning, and we have all the tools of all the statistical methods at our availability. And we could look at everything. We could look at a lot of things. Human beings are multidimensional. I could tell you my shoe size. I could tell you my stride. I'm wearing this Apple Watch. I can tell you 1,000 things about me. My heartbeat, how fast my heart speeds up or slows down according to stress. For a time, I wore a blood glucose monitor. I could keep track of my the moles of sugars in my bloodstream. So there's lots of ways that you could know me, lots of ways that you could categorize me. And there are lots of protocols that I could enter in if I'm sorted into the proper league. And I think any self-respecting person would resent being categorized as something they don't want to be categorized as. It's unfair. But let's talk about specifically the corruption that happens when you are in an elite institution and you determine to make representative symbols of people who are orders of magnitude less capable than you are. Let's say I'm the president of Princeton. And let's say that I have been convinced by what happened in Minnesota, even though I'm in New Jersey, that there's a failure that seems to isolate people by race. And even though the person who has become emblematic of that problem, like Michael Brown in Ferguson or George Floyd in Minnesota. Was that Minnesota? I don't know. I honestly don't remember. Because that person could not be made a hero to me. And that police department could be not be made emblematic to me. And that's my engineer's rational thinking. Things that are possible to happen under the laws of physics will happen. And they will happen with a certain frequency. And if that frequency is not a clear and present danger to me, then I'm not going to pay that much attention to it. What happens in Minnesota or in Florida or in Colorado is not necessarily a proximate cause of things that happen in my life. Now, I could buy into the idea that the symbol affects me. I could watch a Superman cartoon and say, I want to be like Superman. And I would change my behavior according to this attitude. But I should know that that's just TV. That there's a giant logarithmic shadow between myself and Clark Kent, even though he pretends to be an ordinary guy. My point here is that if I'm the president of Princeton, and knowing my institution is an order of magnitude more competitive than that of, let's say, Cal State Los Angeles or Cal State Northridge, where I went to college, I could not just say, well, let's use the standards for a segment of the population in response to this aberration, this crazy incident that got all of our attention, all of our focus for a minute, and say, I'm going to modify my institution. I'm going to break protocol at my institution and reach across. So that is what happens. This is Alan Dershowitz going to be the mayor of Ferguson, Missouri. This is, dare I say it, this is tyranny. When you have the capability, when you have the power, when you have the wealth, when you have the intelligence, when you have the will, an unbreakable will to do X, Y, or Z among people you know that you can outcompete, you know that you can outwit, you know that you can outspend, you know that you can overpower, then you are breaking that basic sense of fairness that human beings have. You are breaking the logarithmic shadow. You are taking an order of magnitude more force, more energy, more resources than has ever been put in this place, and you exerting your will. You're taking over. And that is what happens when you break protocol. When you put Michael Jordan on the high school basketball team. Even where he is now. I bet he can still shoot free throws better than the average high school player. So we come around finally to answer the question of whether this is love or hate. Yeah, it might be. But love and hate are not supposed to be part of the equation that tells you whether or not an institution is sound. The point is that the institution, being an institution, is supposed to be immune to those emotions. And unless they are, they're not really fair institutions, because it requires policy, it requires law, it requires logic, it requires disciplines put in place to keep the protocol sound, just like the categorizations of the leagues, based on an understanding of the skill capabilities. At the starting gate of the Olympic sprinters, we understand human reaction time. We can come up with a formula that says from the time something hits the eardrum to the brain processes it as the starting gun to you go, there's a limit where it is humanly possible to do that. And so the random timing of the starting gun, even though it's within maybe half a second, we know how many milliseconds it takes for a false start violation, because we understand that much. If we decide to handicap a player, well, why would we do that? Why would we break the protocol? Because of love or hate? You see what the problem is? Race does not determine those things. Race is a social, emotional thing that we get caught up here in the United States because of our history. And we always knew that it was a bad idea. So why are we breaking protocol in support of that same very idea? If West Berlin and East Berlin no longer exist, how long did it take? What do you know about Black Americans who were born and raised in Alaska? How are they different? How are racial Black people from Nigeria different than the racial Black people from Jamaica? If we were more honest about our sociology, if we took into consideration greater numbers of variables, then we would understand that we individuate ourselves in many different ways. So what we need is a fair and honest look at more things that determine our capabilities, our capacities, and see what makes us anti-fragile. Now, if you've already grown up in a regime that has an iron curtain, then the proper solution to cure that is to get rid of the iron curtain. But while you are still emotionally affected by the presence of the iron curtain over the years that it existed, you're not healed. So emotionally, psychologically, you may be damaged. And so we can't mistake healing for curing. And we must heal. But you don't heal somebody who is damaged by an unfair barrier by placing them in the midst of people with whom they cannot compete fairly. That breaks the institution even more. What's happened since 2020 is that Americans have decided that race matters more, not less. And we have cast doubt on the reasons, the rationale, and the methods of civil rights and the equal opportunity law that every corporation in America had abided by. And we have rhetorically moved beyond affirmative action to DEI. And I have a short explanation for that, which is quite simply this. Inclusion is what we've always been about. That is part of the reason we went against England. The country was founded on the rights of man, which means not kings, but self-government. That individuals can have an aristocracy of merit, in the words of Thomas Jefferson. And that we can secure these things under a different form of government. And rational people have, since those very beginnings, created a Bill of Rights, amendments to the Constitution, that recognize how we do this for all. And we have modified our institutions, not all at once, sometimes state by state or region by region. But the point is that the civil rights movement in this country said America is broken, so we need to fix it. And we took the federal government and moved it. See, I don't have this rehearsed, so I don't necessarily mean that. But there's a difference between civil rights and black power. And the basic difference is civil rights says, live up to your promise, America. Live up to your Constitution. And then we'll be all right. Black power said, America is wrong. It's permanently broken. We have to go somewhere else. We have to make a new nation. That's what black nationalism was about. I know, because I was raised in a black nationalist household. And you would be raised differently in Texas than you would be in Minnesota, differently in New Hampshire than Nevada, different in South Dakota than in North Carolina. And so the leagues and the protocols for the leagues don't all happen at once. Could have a draft. I don't know. But the problem with DEI, quite simply stated, is inclusion is already there. So that's the bait that makes it says, okay, yes, it makes sense. That's what we want. And it's true. It's what we all want. It's something deeply embedded in the nature of this free and open society. Diversity, well, what's diversity? Is diversity intellectual diversity? No, it's racial diversity. So that one's kind of dodgy. You can say, we should have people who are masters at scuba to design our clothing. Because all we have are fashion designers here. How about a dive master? That would make us diverse. I don't think that works. But it might. You never know what serendipity is going to do. But if I were seeking social justice, I don't know. If I were seeking social justice, would I expect it from a corporation? I don't know. If I were seeking social justice, would I play the lottery? I don't know. So what is diversity? Let's try to get a very hardball, serious thing, because I think diversity is squishy. But I think any diversity that means explicitly racial diversity, well, you should know that the U.S. Census is prohibited from asking your religion. Why racial diversity? Why not religious diversity? Why do we not look at income inequality by religion? Surely that's interesting. But no, the whole field of sociology is not interested in promoting religious diversity. We know it exists, but that's not the diversity that we're actually talking about. We're talking about the intersectional diversity that was created by the left in America during the 90s, more or less. Now, the difference between equity and equality is the difference between opportunity and outcome. And you can't force that. You would have to reach across the logarithmic shadow and bend rules. And that's ultimately the injustice of DEI. It's ultimately what corrupts an institution. Now, here's the qualifier on everything, and I think it rounds out just about everything I have to say. We can't simply look at how things are right now. We have to look at things longitudinally, which means we have to understand how things grow. And when we understand how things grow, then we know the right time and the right place to nudge. We could look at the representation of Black Americans in the military and say whether that's above or below their representation in the general population, as that's generally the benchmark, which is not necessarily a good benchmark. It's not necessarily an adequate benchmark, because you don't control whether or not you are African American, but you do control whether or not you decide to work in the military. So that's a treatment effect versus a selection effect. You could look at whether or not Ferguson lies below this level, and you can decide to grow it better. And when you do that, that's reform. That's not revolution. And what you want to do is have reform, which means you can organically grow something that starts small and ends up big. We understand that human beings grow in families and in generations. And there are things that you simply cannot do. You can't raise people like they're in the Matrix and put things into their mind and then they know it. Raising a family takes many years. Growing an adult takes many years. Education, K-12, takes 13 years. And then you still are not finished with your education. Or maybe you will be, so that you can be self-sufficient. You just can't say, boom, you are now equal. Boom, you are now in this league. That takes a tremendous abuse of power to go and say, this 10-year-old now can decide, egregiously speaking, whether or not they should ever be able to have children. This 10-year-old can now decide No. A 10-year-old has to grow and mature to be an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old to make those kinds of decisions. Not only because of their capacity, but because of the time and how people become anti-fragile based on the random forces that grow them. So what I'm trying to say is evolution is more sustainable than revolution. I've kind of run out of ideas. I've kind of run out of juice, but I haven't finished because I'm sure that there are gaps and perhaps some misstatements, but the emphasis is here. In order to make rational progress, you can't rely on dialogue about love and hate. And, that's what I wanted to say. It is obvious that there are inefficiencies. It is obvious that Ferguson, Missouri still exists here. It is obvious that there are institutions that are not populated with champions that can raise the bar for the students who are involved in those institutions. And you need to grow them. And you need to find a way to nurture them rather than poke holes in the upper leagues and try to force people up to make them representative tokens of a class of people, an artificial class of people that you want to change, that you want to apply tyrannical force to in order to make it conform to what you want it to be. And to the extent that everybody in America, or some large percentage of Americans, consider themselves as a white identity, they know that as white people, they are supposed to be the good white people or the bad white people. And because people are expecting to change who white people are, and they think that an alliance of non-white people can, by dint of an activity, the force of DEI, or specifically of equity, of that specifically reaching across that barrier and grabbing someone and putting them on a pedestal, that's going to be the symbolic thing that changes everybody's mind, from love to hate, from rejection to acceptance, from damaged to healed. And I don't think that that's going to work. I think it's a perversion because it's based on the falsehood of race in itself. And any kind of qualification that you would arbitrarily take America's focus rather than Americans' investment over time, but their instant focus, where people don't actually move, where you say, that's a tragedy, therefore we should do this focus, boom, and change it. Then you generate problems. You generate more problems than you do solutions. And that has to do with any number of things. I don't say that it... I say that there are inefficient institutions, and we can predict relatively accurately what kind of student a poor school will produce, or a poor family background will produce. We can be pretty accurate about that. And if you want to make America a better place, then you have to make that growth organic. And the institutional changes that you make are like clearing brush on the hillside, Because once there's a wildfire, you can't put it out. You would need the force of nature to combat that force of nature. And we don't have that. All right? You have to build the building to withstand an earthquake. You can't just send 500,000 people to hold the building up when the earthquake hits. That's a violation. It doesn't work. So, if you really care about Ferguson, Missouri, then invest in Ferguson, Missouri. Say, I'm going to go live in Ferguson, Missouri because I've seen a better place. I'm going to go make that place a better place. And that's what people do when they vote with their feet. We can be emotional about it. We can think of all kinds of pro-social ends to engineer some kind of social justice. And I don't believe that a lot of people are thinking of anything but political expedience. It's not direct love or hate of people. It is the way we emotionally deal with love and hate in trying to formulate policy. It doesn't make sense. It's not rational. I don't think it'll work. But symbolically, you could say it works because that's what football players on the back of their helmets, choose love. Well, there's the answer, right? I don't think so. I hope this helps you think about organic growth, leagues, our innate sense of fairness, where and how we move resources and talent and people, how we grow and sustain them, how we understand our promises based on our founding documents and the Federalist Papers, and our understanding of power, and our understanding of our relationships one to the other, our understanding of all of the attributes that we have as human beings, and why we focus on the artificial ones, the socially constructed ones. Because if you have a social construction, it means you have a regime of truth, which means it is a power relationship between people rather than a natural relationship between people. It is a set of purposes by which you can engineer all kinds of things. And I don't know if Foucault had any understanding about engineering a family, because we didn't need postmodernism to engineer families in hundreds of generations before he was born. So part of this is a criticism of postmodern thought, of social construction and deconstruction, and the rate at which social justice activists or any kind of reaching through the logarithmic shadow with power in order to change society, the rate at which that can actually happen, because it's tyrannical. And the founders understood that. That's why we have three sections of government that fight against each other. And whether they are efficient or inefficient, the power is decentralized. And that's the important thing. So the idea of a coordinated, centralized, that has to be law. And it's not law. Anyway, it's been a wonderful morning. Time for tea. Take care.